At just after 1 in the morning, while most of Granada was asleep, the ground underneath them let go. A magnitude 5.2 earthquake tore through the metropolitan area, shaking people awake, sending debris crashing down off buildings and triggering more than 80 emergency calls in the first few hours alone. And if you think that was a single isolated event, I need to stop you right there, because this is part of something much bigger that's been building in this region. And I want to walk you through exactly what happened, why it happened here of all places, and what's likely still ahead. Thank you for joining me. This is one of those stories that I think deserves the full, careful breakdown, because there's a lot of fear and a lot of confusion swirling around after a night like this. And my job, the same as it always is on this channel, is to cut through that and give you the facts, calmly, clearly, and with your safety as the priority. Let's start with exactly what happened. At 1:04 in the morning local time on a Saturday, an earthquake registering magnitude 5.2 struck with its epicenter near Alhambra, a town sitting right within the greater Granada metropolitan area, just a few kilometers south of the city itself. Spain's National Geographic Institute, the agency responsible for tracking seismic activity across the country, initially placed the magnitude at 5.0, and that number was later revised up to 5.2 as more data came in, which is completely normal in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake. Initial estimates often get refined within the first hours, as seismic stations across the region report in and the full picture comes together. The depth of this quake was shallow, and I want to explain right away why that single detail matters so much for everything that followed. When an earthquake occurs close to the surface, the seismic energy doesn't have as much rock and material to travel through and dissipate before it reaches the people and structures above it, which means a shallow earthquake produces noticeably stronger, sharper shaking at the surface compared to a deeper earthquake of the exact same magnitude. This is a big part of why a 5.2, which in the grand scheme of earthquakes isn't an enormous event, was still capable of producing real, tangible damage and waking people across a huge stretch of southern Spain. And that's exactly what happened. This earthquake was felt far beyond Granada itself. Reports came in from across Andalusia, and the shaking was strong enough to be felt as far away as parts of Castilla-La Mancha, and even up in Madrid, which gives you a sense of just how widely this energy traveled. Andalusia's emergency call service, known as 112, received more than 80 calls related to the earthquake in just the first few hours, coming in from across the region, with only Huelva and Cadiz provinces not reporting calls, which tells you just how broadly this was felt across the south of the country. Let's talk about the damage, because there has been real physical damage reported, and I want to walk through this honestly. In Granada and in surrounding municipalities, particularly in a town called Armilla, there were reports of falling debris from buildings, damage to facades, and damage to roofs. In one case, that's been reported, falling material actually landed on a vehicle that was parked next to a residential building. Emergency teams moved quickly to begin inspecting buildings across the affected area to determine whether any structures posed an ongoing risk to the people living in them, and authorities urged residents to stay clear of facades, cornices, balconies, and any walls that might have been weakened, and could continue shedding debris in the hours and days that followed. Now, I do want to give you some genuinely important context here, because as of the information available, there have been no fatalities and no injuries reported from this earthquake, and I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because a 5.2 striking a populated metropolitan area at 1 in the morning, with people asleep and unable to react quickly, had real potential for a much worse outcome, and the fact that we're talking about property damage rather than casualties is genuinely significant. That said, I don't want anyone hearing no injuries reported and thinking this wasn't serious, because Andalusia's regional seismic emergency plan was activated in response to this event, which is not a step authorities take lightly. It reflects the genuine scale of what just happened and the need for coordinated regional response. Let's talk about why this happened here specifically, because I think this is where the story gets really important for understanding what might still be coming. Granada sits in one of the most seismically active regions of the entire Iberian Peninsula, and this isn't a one-off freak occurrence. This is a region with a long, well-documented history of exactly this kind of activity. Over the past 10 years alone, this area has recorded over 100 earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater within a roughly 300-kilometer radius that works out to an average of around 10 significant earthquakes a year. This is genuinely one of the most seismically restless corners of Western Europe. The reason comes down to the broader tectonic setting. Southern Spain sits along the complex boundary zone where the African tectonic plate is slowly converging with the Eurasian plate, and that ongoing collision, playing out over millions of years, has produced the Betic mountain ranges, including the Sierra Nevada right near Granada, and it continues to generate significant seismic stress across this entire region today. This isn't a simple single fault line situation either. This is a genuinely complex zone with multiple fault systems interacting, which is part of why earthquake activity here can be harder to pin down to one clean, predictable source compared to some other seismically active regions of the world. Let's talk about something really important now, because this 5.2 was not an isolated event, and I want to walk you through this sequence, because understanding this changes how we should be thinking about what comes next. In the hours before this main 5.2 struck, the region had already seen a magnitude 3.7 earthquake just hours earlier the same evening. Following the main event, the area continued to shake with additional earthquakes, including a 3, 3, and a 3. 0 magnitude quake later that same day, and activity has continued in the days since, including a 3. 1 magnitude quake a couple of days later, and then, notably, a magnitude 4. 8 earthquakes striking again in almost exactly the same spot, right near Al-Hindin, just a few days after the original 5.2. This is what we call an earthquake swarm, and I want to explain what that term actually means because it's different from a typical main shock and aftershock sequence that you might be more familiar with. In a classic main shock aftershock sequence, you get one large earthquake and then a series of progressively smaller earthquakes that gradually decrease in both size and frequency over time as the fault settles. A swarm behaves differently. You get a cluster of earthquakes of varying sizes, sometimes with several moderate events rather than one clear largest earthquake, occurring close together in time and space without necessarily following the same clean, predictable decay pattern. And what we're seeing in Granada right now, with events ranging from the 3s up through this 5.2 and then a subsequent 4.8 spread out over several days, really does fit the pattern of an active, ongoing swarm rather than a single earthquake with a tidy, fading aftershock tail. I think it's worth mentioning that this isn't even the first time this exact region has experienced a swarm like this in recent memory. Back in early 2021, this same area around Granada experienced a well-documented extended earthquake swarm. Hundreds of shallow quakes recorded over the span of just a couple of months, several of them strong enough to be felt by the population, strong enough to crack walls and throw objects off shelves, and strong enough that the country's own prime minister at the time publicly called for calm and urged residents to stay informed and follow guidance from emergency services. Officials at the time described this kind of activity as genuinely common for this specific region, one of the more seismically active parts of the entire Iberian Peninsula. So when I tell you this new 5.2 is part of an ongoing pattern rather than a bolt out of the blue, I want you to understand that's not speculation. That's based on this region's own well-documented recent history of producing exactly this kind of extended, clustered seismic activity. Let's talk about what this means for the days ahead, because I know that's what everyone in the affected area is really asking right now. Given that we're looking at an active swarm with meaningful earthquakes continuing to occur in the days following the initial 5.2, including that subsequent 4.8, I want to be very honest with you the way I always am on this channel. Continued seismic activity in this region remains a real ongoing possibility, and residents should not assume that because a few quiet hours or even a quiet day has passed, the activity is necessarily finished. Swarms like this can continue for extended periods, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. And while the overall trend in a sequence like this often does gradually taper off over time, that tapering isn't always smooth. And additional moderate to strong earthquakes within the sequence remain a genuine possibility until the activity clearly and sustainably quiets down. I also want to address something directly because I know it's on people's minds. Could this lead to something larger? I want to give you an honest, measured answer here, rather than either dismissing the concern or feeding into unnecessary fear. The vast majority of earthquake swarms, even ones that produce a moderate event like this 5.2, do not go on to produce something significantly larger. That's the statistically expected outcome based on how these sequences typically behave. However, seismologists genuinely cannot rule out the possibility of continued or even escalated activity with full certainty in the middle of an active, ongoing sequence like this one. Earthquake prediction, with that kind of precision, simply isn't something the science can currently offer. What we can say is that continued monitoring by Spain's National Geographic Institute and other seismic agencies will be tracking this closely, and any significant developments will be communicated through official channels. Let's talk practically now, because I always want to leave you with something actionable rather than just information to sit with. If you're in the Granada area or anywhere across this broader affected region of Andalusia, here's what I want you thinking about right now. First, if your home or building sustained any visible damage, cracks in walls, damaged facades, anything that looks structurally concerning, please don't go back inside until it's been properly inspected by qualified personnel, and follow the guidance being given by emergency services and local authorities regarding which structures are currently considered safe. given that this remains an active swarm, a building that's already been weakened by this initial 5. 2 could be at increased risk from any subsequent moderate earthquake in the sequence, so caution here really does matter. Second, stay clear of areas known to have loose or damaged debris. Facades, cornices, balconies, and walls that show damage from this earthquake could continue to shed material, especially if additional shaking occurs, so avoid walking directly beneath these areas where you can. Third, have a plan in place for what you'll do if shaking starts again, and given that we're in an active sequence, I want you treating that as a real possibility rather than a distant one. The guidance remains the same as it always is with earthquakes. Drop, cover, and hold on. Get down low, get under something sturdy like a table, and stay there until the shaking fully stops. Most earthquake injuries actually come from falling objects and debris inside structures, not from buildings collapsing outright. So getting low and protected genuinely is your safest option in the vast majority of situations. Fourth, keep a basic emergency kit accessible, water, a flashlight, any necessary medications, and a way to charge your phone, because if additional significant activity does occur, you want to have the basics ready rather than scrambling in the moment. And fifth, the same thing I say every single time on this channel, regardless of the hazard, check on your neighbors, especially anyone elderly, anyone living alone, or anyone who might be more anxious or more vulnerable during a stretch of ongoing seismic activity like this. Living through an earthquake swarm, where you genuinely don't know if or when the next shake is coming, is a real source of stress. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not like a storm where we can point to a forecast and say, here's exactly when this passes. Earthquake swarms don't offer that same clarity, and that uncertainty is a real burden for the people living through it. So a little extra care and connection with the people around you goes a long way right now. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about the bigger picture here, because I think it helps to understand why a region like Granada deals with this kind of thing somewhat regularly, even though it never becomes any less frightening when it happens. This part of Spain sits atop a genuinely complicated tectonic puzzle. The slow, ongoing convergence between the African and Eurasian plates doesn't express itself through one single, clean fault line the way some other seismically active regions of the world do. Instead, you've got a broad, complex zone of smaller faults all absorbing and releasing stress in their own way. And that complexity is part of why this region can go through such variable stretches of activity, sometimes quiet for extended periods, and then, like we're seeing now, an active swarm producing multiple moderate to strong earthquakes within a matter of days. I also want to mention, because I think it's genuinely fascinating context, that this region has an extraordinary seismic history. If you go back further than just the last decade, southern Spain has experienced significant earthquakes throughout recorded history, and this broader region remains one of the most closely monitored seismic zones in the country, precisely because of that long track record. The infrastructure for monitoring, for rapid response, for coordinated regional emergency planning, all of that exists specifically because Spanish authorities and seismologists understand this region requires that level of ongoing readiness, and honestly, the relatively swift activation of the regional emergency plan and the rapid building inspections we saw following this 5. 2 are a reflection of that preparedness being put into action. So let me bring this together and give you the summary of everything we've covered today. A shallow magnitude 5. 2 earthquakes struck the Granada metropolitan area of southern Spain just after 1 in the morning, centered near the town of Alhambra, producing real, tangible damage, falling debris, damaged facades and roofs, particularly in the town of Armilla, and triggering the activation of Andalusia's seismic emergency plan, along with more than 80 emergency calls in the first few hours. Thankfully, no fatalities or injuries have been reported. This earthquake did not occur in isolation. It's part of an active, ongoing seismic swarm in a region with a well-documented history of exactly this kind of clustered activity, including a notable earthquake swarm in the same area back in 2021. Activity has continued in the days since this main event, including another significant earthquake in the 4. 8 range striking the same general area just days later, and given that pattern, continued seismic activity in the near term remains a real possibility that residents should be prepared for. Stay alert, stay prepared, follow the guidance of local authorities and Spain's National Geographic Institute as this sequence continues to be monitored. And please, check on the people around you, especially anyone who might be struggling with the stress of living through an uncertain, ongoing stretch like this one. We'll get through this the way we get through every hazard on this channel, informed, prepared, and looking out for each other, and I'll keep bringing you updates as this situation continues to develop. Thank you so much for being here. Please share this with anyone in the affected region who needs to see it. And above everything else, please be safe. I'll see you in the next update.